They survived using food preservation methods you would barely believe were real. Cold pits in the ground, warm layers of ash, underground streams, and practices that feel unsettling even to imagine today. Each method was a quiet gamble, with decay shaped by fear, hunger, and instinct. No one truly knows how these ideas first appeared, nor how many lives were lost before they worked. Tonight, you will step into that distant world and watch how survival clung to every piece of food they could save. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of a prehistoric camp and watch how people handled their meals, it would become clear that the greatest danger they faced was not hunger itself, but the food turning against them before they could eat it. Long before tools resembled anything familiar, and long before anyone understood the smallest thing about bacteria, people lived with the constant fear that a single mistake with their food could bring sickness, weakness, and death. Their world was built on the edge of survival, and every piece of meat, every root pulled from the dirt carried both nourishment and risk. The smell of rot, sharp and unmistakable, did more than wrinkle noses. It pulled predators out of the darkness, drew flies in thick clouds, and warned entire groups that something had already gone wrong. A foul odor could scatter a camp as surely as a storm, because everyone knew what followed: disease spreading through the group, children collapsing first, adults soon after. In a time when the line between life and death rested on the thin crust of a dried hide or the dampness inside a clay pit, spoiled food was a silent enemy that threatened them every day. They had no cold storage, no containers designed to seal out air, and no way to slow decay except through distance and hope. Meat left too long became a magnet for wolves, hyenas, and bears, turning a small error into a deadly confrontation. The simplest meals became lessons carved into memory. Eat quickly, eat carefully, do not trust the air. A single misstep meant illness that could spread through a camp with terrible efficiency. Because in prehistoric life, sickness did not come softly. It arrived abruptly with cramps that bent people over the ground, fevers that burned through the night, and weakness that left even the strongest unable to lift a stone tool. It feels almost absurd to imagine entire families frightened by the scent of a leftover scrap, yet that was the reality of people who lived one spoiled meal away from disaster. Every food decision, when to eat, how much to save, where to leave it, was shaped by this fear. I often picture the camps of early humans as places of constant calculation. Meat from a successful hunt could feed many, but only for a short time. The heat of the day worked against them, turning food quickly, pushing people to eat more than they needed, because leaving anything behind felt like inviting danger into their home. The ground was both friend and enemy. Burying food might hide it from animals, but moisture welcomed decay. Hanging meat in the air helped sometimes, but wind carried the smell farther than they wished. There was no perfect choice, only a fragile balance where instinct stood in place of knowledge. When thinking about it in modern terms, it resembles living in a world where every refrigerator door causes food to rot faster instead of keeping it safe. Nothing stayed fresh unless handled immediately, and nothing was truly secure. Those who lived in these early ages did not speak of bacteria or contamination. They understood harm through the body's response. A child vomiting after a bad piece of meat was a warning. An elder, whose breath grew shallow after a meal, showed the rest of the group what mistakes to avoid. Survival required attention to every uncomfortable detail: the slickness on a piece of fat, the change in color near a bone, the appearance of tiny insects crawling along the surface. Yet decay moved faster than their caution. A warm wind, a damp night, or a missed hour could transform food into something lethal. I find it unsettling to imagine how every bite carried uncertainty, a quiet gamble no one could escape. To them, eating was not a simple daily act. It was a negotiation with forces they could not name. Those who lived close to rivers faced different troubles. Water kept food cool only briefly, but currents carried scent downstream, alerting animals that something edible lay nearby. Camps near forests dealt with insects that swarmed within minutes of a kill. Plains dwellers faced the scorching sun, which punished anything left uncovered. Regardless of where people lived, food spoilage shaped behavior, habits, and even migration. Some groups stayed on the move not only to follow animals, but because remaining in one place too long increased the risk of accumulated waste smells and sickness. Fire helped them cook, but cooked food rotted too, just more slowly. Hunger pushed them forward while decay pushed them faster. Parents were especially cautious, though caution sometimes failed them. A child given a scrap that looked fine might fall ill within hours, and without herbal knowledge or remedies, families could do nothing but watch. This cycle repeated generation after generation, until instinct hardened into tradition. People learned to read the faintest signals and trust them absolutely. If something seemed off in terms of texture, smell, or temperature, it was discarded immediately. Waste was better than death. Yet waste also meant hunger. And hunger was its own danger. Decisions were never simple. They always came with consequences. Some groups adopted early strategies, crude but necessary eating at the site of the kill, dividing food so nothing remained, leaving the least stable portions for animals to scavenge. These choices were not about generosity. They were about safety. The ground around a campfire was often littered with bones, not because people were careless, but because they chose to strip meat quickly and abandon the risky parts. This world demanded constant vigilance, and its lessons were written in every scar, every burial mound, every story passed quietly between elders. If modern people find the thought of spoiled food distasteful, prehistoric people found it terrifying. Death moved silently through meals, not dramatically but steadily without remorse. To bargain with that threat was to survive another day. Their strategies would evolve in the centuries ahead, but here at the beginning of it all, rotting food was a presence felt as sharply as hunger and as relentlessly as cold wind across the plains. In the face of such uncertainty, they lived each day, knowing that what fed them could just as easily destroy them, a truth that shaped their caution more deeply than any threat from outside their camps. Their struggle with spoilage revealed how fragile their world truly was. The choices they made in those early moments slowly pushed them toward new ways of protecting what little they had. Something in their search for safety would soon lead them to a method far more daring than fear itself. The earliest humans learned quickly that the safest place to eat was the very ground where the animal had fallen. Once a hunt ended, the group rarely waited, rarely traveled, and rarely hesitated. They gathered around the kill, stripped away meat with sharpened flakes, and consumed it while the heat of the animal's body was still rising into the air. This was not a ritual or a celebration. It was a necessity shaped by danger. Moving a carcass across open land meant dragging the scent of blood behind it, leaving a trail that predators would follow without mercy. The longer the body remained whole, the stronger the smell and the greater the risk. Eating immediately was not simply convenience, it was survival in its rawest form. The kill site often became a temporary shelter, a place where time compressed into minutes defined by urgency. People crouched low, scanning the horizon even as they chewed because the world around them did not pause for their hunger. Vultures circled almost instantly, casting shadows that reminded the hunters they were not alone. Hyenas lurked at the edges of visibility. Wolves, sensing weakness or distraction, tested the perimeter with cautious steps. To linger too long was dangerous, but to delay eating was worse. Meat changed fast under the sun, and even a short walk back to camp could transform fresh flesh into something risky. It almost seems mocking that the very moment of success, bringing an animal down, immediately forced them into frantic calculations about how fast it would rot or who might arrive to steal it. Those who lived in this age accepted these conditions without question. They tore strips of meat that were still steaming, passing what they could to children and elders first, knowing that strength had to be shared immediately. Fat liver and softer organs were consumed on the spot because they spoiled the fastest. Bones were cracked open to drink the warm marrow, a source of energy too valuable to waste. Only the toughest cuts were sometimes carried away, and even then, they were sliced into small pieces to reduce weight and speed movement. Every decision they made reflected the awareness that death lingered close, whether in the form of predators or invisible illness rising from decaying flesh. In those moments, movement was both an enemy and an ally. To stay meant exposure, to leave meant risk. The hunters learned to reduce scent by smearing themselves with dirt or ash, masking the blood enough to avoid immediate pursuit. Yet even these efforts had limits. The smell of a fresh kill traveled far, carried by wind and memory, shared by countless predators. The urgency of eating at the site was born from this reality. Every minute mattered, every bite was a calculation, every sound in the grass a potential threat. It was a tense balance between nourishment and vulnerability. Many modern people imagine the prehistoric hunt as a triumphant moment, a clean victory, leading to leisurely feasts beneath the open sky. In truth, the experience more closely resembles eating a meal in a place where every noise in the distance might signal a life-ending interruption. There was no comfort in these meals, no gratitude for flavor, no time to savor anything. Hands trembled from exertion, breath remained ragged, and the air around them carried the metallic scent of blood mixed with dust. The kill site was not a dining area. It was a brief negotiation with a world that did not care whether they survived. I often think about how heavy the bodies of hunted animals were, and how impractical it must have been to move them long distances. Even for groups that hunted cooperatively, the strain of dragging or lifting the carcass would slow them enough to risk attack. Their instinct to eat immediately was not just about spoilage, it was about speed. The faster the body disappeared because it was eaten, the less likely predators were to track them. I find it unsettling to imagine the pressure of eating under such conditions, where every swallow felt like a race against time. They could not afford hesitation. Hunger was constant, but fear sharpened their focus even more. The environment shaped these instincts as much as necessity did. In forests, thick undergrowth created hidden dangers. In plains, open visibility meant predators approached at great speed. Near lakes or rivers, crocodiles and other hunters emerged from the water unexpectedly. Wherever early humans lived, the kill site became a point of conflict between them and the world around them. They responded with the only tool they had: immediacy. Eat now, move later. The body needed energy, but it also needed distance from the place where danger multiplied. Children learned these rules early. They watched adults scanning the horizon while chewing, observing the tension that filled every successful hunt. They learned to swallow quickly, to avoid dropping food, to remain silent when shadows appeared in the distance. The kill site was their classroom, and every lesson was delivered through the harsh truth of nature. There was no room for misunderstanding. A wrong move, a delayed reaction, or a moment of distraction could cost them everything. Despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, eating at the kill site became a deeply ingrained behavior across generations. It shaped culture, memory, and instinct. Some groups created small rings of stones to stand on while eating, so that their feet would not slip in blood. Others designated individuals to watch for predators, while the rest consumed the meat. These practices reveal just how essential this instinct was. Life depended on it, and everyone understood that. The pressure to avoid leaving a scent trail influenced how food was handled as well. Blood-soaked hides were sometimes abandoned, left behind to divert predators while the group escaped. In other cases, hunters would quickly burn scraps to eliminate odors. Everything about their actions pointed toward immediate consumption and rapid departure. There was no illusion of safety. Danger sat beside them, as tangibly as the meat they tore apart. But they accepted it, because the alternative waiting was often more lethal than confronting the present threat. In this way, eating at the site of a kill was not simply the first instinct. It was the foundation of their survival strategy. This constant balance between hunger and fear defined their earliest choices, revealing how instinct guided them long before knowledge took form. Their willingness to act quickly changed the way they interacted with every successful hunt. In the urgency of those moments, new patterns of food handling quietly emerged, and somewhere within those patterns lay the beginnings of methods far more deliberate than instinct alone. Long before humans understood anything about temperature or microorganisms, they learned that the soil beneath their feet behaved differently from the air around them. Food left above ground changed quickly, meat darkened, insects gathered, and the scent carried far. But when buried beneath a layer of cold earth, the transformation slowed. People discovered this not through study but through desperation, after returning to a kill's location and finding scraps preserved by shade or damp soil. From that accidental discovery grew one of the earliest attempts to save food, digging shallow pits in shaded areas and lowering meat into the cool darkness. They chose places with care, though they did not phrase it that way. A pit dug beneath a large rock stayed colder. One hidden under dense foliage attracted fewer insects. Another beside a tree's north side remained untouched by direct sunlight. Everything depended on instinct, sharpened by repeated loss. Food, hidden poorly spoiled fast, and the consequences were obvious in the color of the flesh, the smell rising from the pit, or the sickness that followed a careless meal. It is almost darkly humorous how prehistoric people, without any science, became unwilling experts in detecting rot long before it formed. Soil was more than a container. It was a barrier. It muted scent, slowed blood from oxidizing, and concealed food from predators. A buried piece of meat no longer announced itself to the forest or the plains, and this anonymity became a form of protection. Hunters who had spent hours pursuing prey were unwilling to lose their reward to scavengers that arrived moments later. Digging a pit was quicker than constructing any structure, safer than carrying heavy meat long distances, and more reliable than hoping that animals would lose interest. The earth itself responded to their choices. Cooler ground drew warmth from the meat, stabilizing it in ways they did not understand but trusted. Dry soil prevented moisture from accelerating decay, while shaded areas maintained lower temperatures that preserved food longer. They learned to avoid marshy ground, where water seeped into pits and ruined everything, and to avoid exposed areas where the sun heated the earth too quickly. Finding the right place became a skill in itself, one passed from hunters to youths, who followed quietly behind, watching their elders scoop earth with hands or stone tools. In these acts, one can see the early shape of intentional preservation, primitive, imprecise, but undeniably purposeful. People began marking their hidden pits with stones or branches so they could return later. Sometimes, they dug several pits near one another, distributing risk the way future societies would use multiple storage jars or granaries. They did not trust a single hiding place. The world was too unpredictable for that. Rain might wash soil away, animals might dig through it, or insects might discover the meat despite the coldness below. Yet even with these flaws, burial offered more security than leaving food exposed. For those who lived near arid regions, the dryness of the soil added another advantage. Meat stored in these places did not just stay fresh longer. It often dried slightly, becoming tougher but more resistant to decay. Forest dwellers developed a different relationship with soil, learning to use leaf litter as an additional layer. Each environment forced its inhabitants to adapt the burial method differently, creating a mosaic of practices shaped entirely by necessity. To think of this method in today's terms, it is like relying on the ground itself as a silent, untrustworthy refrigerator. It worked often enough to matter, yet failed spectacularly when conditions changed. Humans accepted these inconsistencies with the same quiet endurance that defined their lives. When food re-emerged safe to eat, it was a victory. When it spoiled, it was another reminder that survival favored no one. Buried food had its own dangers. Meat could harden to a point where it was difficult to chew or take on the flavor of damp soil. Animals sometimes unearthed it during the night and consumed everything before people returned in the morning. And there were moments when groups weakened by hunger or weather dug up pits too soon and ate meat that was barely preserved at all. Still, the practice endured because it broadened the narrow margin between nourishment and spoilage. I often imagine the quiet moments when a hunter knelt beside a pit, brushing aside leaves and soil, to reveal a piece of meat that remained untouched. I find it remarkable how such a simple gesture, lifting food from the ground, was tied so closely to their hope of surviving another day. Beneath the surface, the earth became a partner, unreliable but indispensable. As trials and errors accumulated, people refined their choices. They sought higher ground where drainage was better. They dug deeper pits in colder seasons and shallower ones when the earth was warm. They surrounded their hiding places with natural markers that blended into the environment so animals would overlook them. These efforts reveal a growing awareness, a slow shift from reacting to understanding. Eating from the earth was an act of trust, one built from repeated hardship. And though they never articulated the reasoning, their hands, habits, and instincts understood what their minds could not. The cold ground became the first technology that humans used to slow the time it took for food to slip beyond usefulness and into danger. Their attempts to hide food beneath the soil revealed how desperately they sought to slow decay in a world that refused to wait. In that struggle, they unknowingly took their first step toward shaping the ways humans would store food for ages to come. Something awaited them beyond these pits in the earth, a discovery that would change how they confronted rot itself. For people living in the earliest ages, decay moved so quickly that even moments felt dangerous. Meat taken from a fresh kill could shift in texture and smell before the sun reached its highest point. Faced with this relentless change, some groups turned not to tools or containers because they had none, but to the materials already covering their world. Among the most unconventional were ash and animal blood substances, always present after a hunt or a fire. Each served a purpose that people grasped only through repetition, loss, and hard-earned instinct. Ash was the first of these materials to become part of their attempts at preservation. After cooking or burning wood, A pale, weightless layer remained something that did not attract insects and did not carry a scent strong enough to draw predators. When hunters noticed that pieces of meat touching the cooled ash seemed to dry more slowly, they began spreading it intentionally. Ash absorbed moisture, clinging to the surface of the flesh in a thin coating that slowed the early stages of rot. It did not stop spoilage entirely, but it bought time, precious time in a world where every hour mattered. It is almost grimly amusing that the waste of their fires became a tool more valuable than anything they could carve with stone. Not all ash worked the same way. Soft, powdery ash from dry wood coated meat easily, while denser ash from roots or damp branches clumped together and became useless. People learned to recognize which piles cooled fastest and which felt finer between their fingers. They pressed this knowledge into habit, sprinkling ash with deliberate motions covering every exposed surface. Ash did not taste pleasant, but its presence signaled caution rather than comfort. If a piece of meat emerged from its burial covered in pale residue, it meant someone had tried to save it. Animal blood served a different function. When fresh blood formed a protective film over meat, sealing off air for a brief time. Hunters realized this by accident, often while carrying organs or limbs that had been packed tightly together. Meat coated in blood spoiled less quickly, though the effect lasted only until the blood dried and cracked. In some regions, groups deliberately dipped smaller pieces of meat in warm blood from the kill, creating a temporary shield against insects and exposure. The idea was simple. If moisture could be forced outward or trapped beneath a layer, decay would take longer to begin. Compared with practices today, this method resembles spreading crude, uneven layers of wax over food, except that the material came directly from the animal itself. It was far from clean, far from predictable, and far from safe. Blood dried inconsistently, sometimes sealing the meat too well, creating pockets where bacteria flourished unseen. At other times, the coating flaked off too quickly to serve any purpose. Yet even with these flaws, people kept using it, because alternatives were scarce, and the threat of rot never relented. I often imagine how these early attempts must have looked: meat dusted with pale ash, turning it the color of cold stone, or dripping with a dark sheen that soon stiffened into a crust. I find it deeply unsettling to picture how people placed their hopes in such fragile layers, trusting materials they barely understood to protect food they desperately needed. Their choices were not guided by comfort or confidence, but by the quiet terror of starvation and sickness. These methods carried risks that were obvious even then. Ash could carry small embers, if not fully cooled, scorching the meat, or even starting small fires in dry grass. Blood attracted insects once it began to congeal, drawing flies that laid eggs in hidden folds. People learned to combine both materials, coating meat in blood first, then dusting it lightly with ash, an early attempt to create multiple barriers at once. Whether this worked depended on the weather timing and chance more than anything else. The practice varied widely depending on the environment. Groups living where wood was plentiful relied heavily on ash, collecting it from old fire pits and storing it in animal skins. Those in colder climates depended more on blood, assuming the cold air would slow spoilage long enough for the film to serve its purpose. In warmer regions, both methods struggled, but they remained in use simply because no better options existed. Though crude, these attempts reveal how early humans refused to surrender to decay. They experimented with what they had, even when the results were unpredictable. They watched, adjusted, and tried again. Their methods dangerous, as they were allowed families to carry small amounts of food away from kill sites, helping them move without attracting predators. Ash and blood were imperfect tools, often unreliable, but they marked a step forward in humanity's long battle against rot. They showed that people were willing to manipulate the materials around them, not just accept the conditions imposed by the environment. These early choices formed the groundwork for more complex techniques to come. Methods shaped by necessity, sharpened by danger, and refined through countless failures. Their struggle to slow decay pushed them toward experiments, as strange as they were desperate. In those crude mixtures of ash and blood lay the beginnings of intention rather than instinct. A deeper idea waited beyond these early attempts, hinting at a method that would alter how they confronted rot. Across the ancient landscape, long before smoke or salt became part of human knowledge, sunlight alone offered a solution to the relentless decay that threatened their food. Hunters who returned to camp with meat quickly realized that the air beneath the open sky behaved differently from the earth below. When flesh was sliced thin and laid across warm stone, the sun pulled moisture from it piece by piece, altering its texture and slowing the advance of rot. What began as an observation slowly evolved into one of the earliest deliberate techniques of food preservation. Drying required patience and attention, two qualities shaped by the harshness of their world. The strips of meat had to be thin enough for the sun to reach through them, yet thick enough to retain nourishment. Even a small mistake in thickness meant uneven drying, inviting insects or causing rapid spoilage. People learned through loss more than success, watching entire racks of meat turn useless because clouds arrived too soon, or because the air carried more moisture than they expected. But when the conditions were right, clear skies, low humidity, steady heat, the transformation was almost miraculous. The meat stiffened, darkened, and became resistant to the early stages of decay, allowing groups to carry it for days or even weeks. The stones used for drying mattered as much as the meat itself. Flat slabs warmed by midday sun provided a steady source of heat that complemented the drying process. People placed the strips, carefully adjusting their positions as shadows shifted. Some groups elevated the stones with smaller rocks beneath them, so air could flow from below, while others left the meat exposed on natural outcrops. A surface too cold slowed the drying. A surface too hot scorched the meat. The balance was delicate, yet achieved through repeated trial. Insects always present forced people to adapt further. Smoke from dying embers was sometimes wafted over the drying meat to drive flies away, even though they did not yet understand why this helped. Others placed drying racks in breezy areas, where wind kept insects from settling. Predators too became a threat. The scent of drying flesh, though less intense than fresh meat, still carried far enough to draw unwanted attention. Camps took turns watching the drying area, knowing that one moment of distraction could mean losing days of labor. It is oddly ironic that a task as simple as leaving meat in the sun demanded more vigilance than many of their daily activities. Drying was slow, and slowness made them vulnerable. Children were taught to keep their distance, so they would not knock stones over or step on precious food. They observed the adults turning strips of meat with careful fingers, brushing away dirt or insects, and repositioning pieces so the sun reached every surface. The benefits, however, were undeniable. Sun-dried meat weighed far less than fresh meat, making it easier to transport when groups migrated. Its toughness was both an inconvenience and an advantage. Predators found it less appealing, and its faint scent reduced the risk of being followed. When chewed, the dried pieces released concentrated nourishment that could sustain a person longer than fresh meat of the same size. Viewed through a modern lens, it resembles using a natural, unpredictable dehydrator powered entirely by weather that could change without warning. I often imagine the quiet scene of early humans gathering around slabs of stone, checking the progress of their food. They did not celebrate the drying process, nor did they rush it. Instead, they tolerated its slowness because it offered the promise of survival beyond the immediate moment. I find it strangely compelling that preservation through drying depended not on tools or technology, but on the patience of those who lived with danger, pressing in from all sides. They accepted that the sun, harsh as it was, could be both enemy and guardian. Drying also shaped their understanding of time. While eating at a kill site required only minutes, drying demanded full days of waiting. This waiting created space for planning something rare in a life dominated by urgency. Groups began preparing drying areas in advance of hunts, anticipating success, even when success was uncertain. They arranged stones, cleared debris, and watched the sky for signs of favorable weather. These small acts hinted at a shift in how they approached food, not just reacting to the moment, but preparing for the days ahead. Still, the practice held risks. Sudden rain ruined everything. Windstorms carried dust that settled on the meat. Animals stole pieces at night if the guards slept too deeply. And in colder climates, sunlight alone was not strong enough, forcing groups to abandon drying altogether for months at a time. The technique changed with the land, but its core remained constant. Remove moisture and decay loses its hold. As drying became more widespread, it subtly altered how humans interacted with one another. Groups with successful drying methods could travel farther, feed more members, and survive leaner seasons. They traded dried strips with others, exchanging knowledge without speaking it aloud. Those who mastered the technique gained a small but significant advantage in a world where advantage often meant survival. Drying by sunlight was not perfect, not consistent, and not safe from interruption, but it represented a profound shift. It was one of the first times humans manipulated the environment intentionally to extend the life of their food. It was a moment when instinct met experiment and produced something new. Their reliance on sunlight revealed a growing desire to control the fleeting nature of fresh meat. In learning to borrow time from the heat above them, they unlocked a fragile but vital form of security. Another method waited beyond this one, shaped not by stone and sun, but by smoke drifting upward through the air. Fire gave early humans more than warmth and protection. It offered a new way to push back against the decay that consumed their food so quickly. When hunters placed meat near the flames, they noticed that smoke clung to its surface, leaving behind a darkened layer with a scent unlike anything found in the natural world. At first, this may have seemed like an accidental effect, just another byproduct of cooking or keeping predators away. But over time, people realized that the meat exposed to smoke spoiled more slowly than the meat left untouched. What began as a coincidence soon became an intention. Tying meat above or beside a fire required far more care than sun-drying. The meat could not be too close, or it would cook unevenly, too far, and the smoke would not penetrate deeply enough. People suspended pieces from branches or cords made of sinew, adjusting their height as embers shifted. They learned to maintain fires that smoldered rather than blazed, because thick, slow-moving smoke offered better protection than the quick flames. Smoke carried compounds that instinctively repelled insects and hindered the early stages of rot, even if these people never understood why. All they knew was that meat that smelled of smoke lasted longer. The process turned the interior of their shelters into dim, fragrant chambers where dried herbs, hides, and meat hung suspended like silent guardians of survival. Many groups deliberately built small fires inside shallow pits beneath these hanging racks, controlling airflow by shielding one side with stones. Others created simple wooden frames that allowed smoke to circulate evenly. It was not a clean process. Ash drifted everywhere. Soot gathered on skin, hair, and tools. But the benefits outweighed the discomfort. It is almost darkly comical how a method that coated everything in grime became one of the most effective protections they had. Predators approached smoked meat less frequently than fresh or sun-dried meat. The scent masked the natural odor of flesh-confusing animals that relied on their noses to locate food. Humans understood this advantage quickly. They prepared smoked meat before long migrations, knowing the reduced scent trail decreased the risk of being followed. This gave them mobility, and mobility meant safety. Wind and weather changed the effect of the smoke dramatically. A sudden shift in direction could scatter the smoke too widely, weakening the process. Rain extinguished fires and forced groups to restart the entire effort. Still, people persisted. The sight of smoke rising steadily into the air became not just a mark of fire, but a signal of preparation for the days ahead. Insects' ever-present adversaries were less bold around smoke. Flies avoided the fumes, allowing the surface of the meat to dry undisturbed. This mattered more than most people today might imagine. Placed in contemporary terms, it is like relying on a natural chemical shield, uneven but still capable of reducing the constant threat hovering around every meal. Without smoke, insects laid eggs in the folds of meat, turning potential nourishment into a silent hazard. With smoke, that threat diminished, though never vanished entirely. I often think about the atmosphere inside those early shelters. Dark beams coated in soot skins stretched along rafters, the faint crackle of embers beneath. I find it striking how the smell of smoke, something many people now associate with comfort or memory, was for them a marker of vigilance and necessity. They did not gather around the fire to relax. They gathered to prevent starvation. The effectiveness of the method depended heavily on the type of wood used. Woods rich in resin produced thick smoke that flavored the meat strongly, sometimes even overpoweringly. Woods that burned clean offered less protection. People learned this through careful attention to the results of their efforts. They sought particular trees, collected fallen branches selectively, and maintained knowledge about their preferences. In some environments, this meant long walks and heavy loads, but the reward was meat that lasted longer and traveled farther. Smoking meat also taught humans to manipulate time in a new way. Unlike drying, which mostly depended on the sun and wind, smoking required constant management. Someone needed to watch the fire adjust branches, ensure the meat did not fall, and maintain the right temperature. These tasks required cooperation. Communities became more connected through the act of preserving food, and the shared responsibility strengthened social bonds. Food preservation was not just practical, it was communal. The method carried its own hazards. Fires could grow too strong, scorching the meat, or worse, igniting shelters. Children sometimes wandered too close, inhaling smoke that irritated their lungs. Ash mixed into the meat when the wind turned suddenly. Even the structure holding the meat could collapse, burning everything, and forcing the group to begin again. Despite all this, smoking remained one of the most relied upon techniques. Its success lay in its versatility. Meat could be smoked partially for short journeys or left hanging for many days to create a tougher, long-lasting product. Fatty cuts responded differently from lean ones, teaching humans to adjust their methods based on the food at hand. Over time, smoking became not just a reaction to decay, but a deliberate strategy embedded in their routines. Smoke offered a fragile barrier against the forces they could not otherwise control. It extended the life of their food just enough to make the difference between hunger and endurance, between staying and moving, between vulnerability and preparation. Their willingness to stand beside smouldering fires revealed how far they were willing to bend the world to slow the advance of rot. Beneath the haze of smoke, they found a small but vital way to resist the dangers that surrounded them. A new challenge soon emerged, one tied to the precious mineral that glimmered from within stones and caves. Long before humans understood why meat spoiled or what invisible forces worked against them, they discovered a substance that altered their relationship with decay in ways neither ash nor smoke could match. Salt, hidden in rock formations or clinging to the walls of certain caves, did not reveal its value quickly. It was found by chance, licked by animals, glittering faintly like pale crystals or crumbling beneath the pressure of a curious hand. But once people realized how it reacted with flesh, salt became one of the most powerful tools they had for resisting rot. Early groups approached salt with caution. Its taste was sharp and unfamiliar, far different from the blandness of stones or the bitterness of certain plants. Some believe the first use may have come from watching wounded animals visit natural salt licks to soothe themselves. Others may have broken open stones along riverbeds, finding the mineral inside by accident. Regardless of how they discovered it, the moment they noticed meat changed when rubbed with the crystals marked a turning point in their struggle against decay. Charring, drying, and smoking all slowed spoilage, but salt did something more. It drew water out of the meat, shrinking it, tightening it, and leaving behind a surface less welcoming to the early stages of decomposition. Moisture was the ally of decay, and salt weakened that alliance. When hunters pressed rough crystals into the flesh of fish or thin cuts of meat, they watched liquid seep out, gradually carrying away some of the vulnerability that invited rot. Salt was not abundant everywhere, and the difficulty of obtaining it shaped how it was used. Groups living near caves, rich in mineral deposits, gathered it in small fragments, breaking them with stone tools and carrying them in hide pouches. Those near dried lakes or coastal areas sometimes find salt crusted on the ground, forming brittle sheets that snapped cleanly under pressure. For inland tribes, salt was rare enough that it was reserved for the most delicate pieces, the parts of an animal that spoiled first, or the food intended for the youngest and weakest. Rubbing salt into meat required effort. Hands grew raw from pressing the crystals into the fibers, and the flesh tightened in response. Flakes dissolved unevenly, leaving some areas heavily coated, while others remained vulnerable. Even so, the results were undeniable. It is almost darkly amusing how a substance that stung cuts on their skin became a silent partner in keeping them alive. Salt offered consistency that ash and blood never could. The process of salting also carried a weight of patience. Meat had to rest after being treated, often laid on flat stones, or hung beneath shelters where wind and shade worked together to complete the transformation. People checked the progress by touch and smell, noting how the surface hardened, how the edges lost their softness. They trusted these changes, even though they could not explain them. Preservation was not a science to them. It was a pattern recognized through experience. Salt's capacity to slow decay varied with temperature, humidity, and the type of meat. Fish responded more quickly than red meat. Thin cuts preserved better than thick ones. But salt's biggest advantage lay in its ability to prevent the blooming of unseen threats, the early patterns of decay that had stolen countless meals from them before. Seen from today's perspective, the use of salt worked like applying a primitive, uneven chemical defense that reduced the dangers waiting beneath the surface of fresh meat. I often imagine the quiet concentration of those early humans as they rubbed salt crystals along strips of meat, watching water bead up and drip down. I find it remarkable how a mineral they barely understood inspired such deliberate care. They may not have known the term for preservation, but they sensed its importance in every movement of their hands. Salt also brought new risks. Animals could smell it from far away, even when humans believed the scent minor. Packs of wolves learned that salted meat meant human presence. Bears dug into caves where groups stored their crystals. Even insects behaved strangely around heavily salted food, avoiding some areas while clustering around the moisture that remained. These inconsistencies forced groups to adapt, experimenting with combinations of drying and salting to increase safety. Despite these challenges, salt remained unrivaled. It extended the life of food in ways that gave families confidence to travel longer distances and endure harsher seasons. It became a tool not only of survival, but of planning. Groups stored salted strips for journeys or for moments when hunting became scarce. The mineral changed their understanding of time, creating a buffer against the unpredictable world around them. Salt also influenced early trade. Tribes possessing natural salt deposits gained an advantage, exchanging small quantities with neighboring groups in return for tools, hides, or knowledge. These exchanges created early pathways of social interaction, driven not by conquest but by survival. Salt reshaped their ability to live, move, and endure. Its discovery may have been accidental, but its impact was transformative. The mineral clung to their hands, their tools, and their memories, becoming a reminder that even in a harsh world, solutions could emerge from the simplest of materials. Their discovery of salt revealed how a single mineral could shift the balance between decay and preservation. In learning to press those pale crystals into their food, they unlocked a new layer of control over the forces that threatened them. What emerged next was an approach relying not on minerals or heat, but on creatures drawn to the earliest scent of decay. In the harshness of prehistoric life, preservation did not always take forms that later generations would consider clean or acceptable. When every scrap of food mattered and decay never hesitated, some groups turned to a method that emerged not from luck or minerals, but from observing the behavior of the smallest creatures drawn to meat. They noticed that flies often laid eggs in flesh beginning to spoil, and that the larvae consumed the softening portions first. What began as an unpleasant observation slowly transformed into a deliberate, if unsettling, tactic, allowing controlled infestation to remove the earliest stages of rot before humans reclaimed the meat. This method required an understanding of timing more precise than any other. Meat left exposed for too long became dangerous, but meat left exposed for just the right moment allowed the larvae to eat away parts that would otherwise have spoiled and spread foulness. Hunters placed smaller cuts in shaded, partially enclosed spaces where flies would settle but predators would not. They monitored the flesh not with tools, but with eyes trained by necessity. The larvae's work, though repulsive to consider, now effectively stripped away the sections most vulnerable to rapid decay. It was not a method every group embraced. Some viewed insects with suspicion or disgust, an instinct shared across ages. Others, driven by scarcity, experimented out of desperation. Once the larvae had consumed the compromised tissue, people washed the meat thoroughly, scraping away what remained of the infestation. Only after this cleansing did they cook it, often over high heat, to eliminate any lingering danger. It is almost bleakly amusing that a process involving insects devouring parts of their food was seen as a practical solution rather than a last resort. The success of this method depended heavily on the environment. In regions where insects thrived, particularly in warm climates, the tactic proved more effective. In colder environments, larvae developed too slowly to offer real benefit. Groups learned these patterns unconsciously, adjusting their actions in quiet, instinctive ways. They did not speak of preservation as a concept. They simply responded to results. If a method saved food, it was repeated. If it caused sickness, it was abandoned. Though primitive, this approach reflected an early understanding that decay could be managed indirectly. Instead of fighting rot with heat or minerals, they allowed nature to intervene first. Flies, attracted to the smell of weakening flesh, performed the initial stage of decomposition in a controlled window. People then interrupted the process before it progressed too far. In this narrow span, they found opportunity where others would see only waste. The risks were obvious even then. Meat left too long became inedible. Larvae that burrowed too deeply contaminated the flesh beyond repair. Weather could accelerate or slow infestation, making timing unpredictable. Yet humans persisted because hunger overrode hesitation. Fresh kills did not last, sun-drying required clear skies, smoking demanded stable fires, and salt was rare. Insects, however, were everywhere. Viewed in the context of modern life, it resembles relying on a crude, self-operating cleanup system that functions only under unpredictable conditions. Children watched adults handle this process with solemn focus. They learned to judge whether the larvae had consumed enough and when the window for recovery had closed. They learned which parts of the animal could withstand such treatment and which spoiled too quickly. They learned above all that survival often required choices more uncomfortable than hunger itself. I find it disturbing, yet strangely revealing, that necessity pushed them towards solutions that blurred the line between preservation and decomposition. Washing the meat afterward became a ritual of caution. Water was scarce in many regions, so people used handfuls of sand or ashes to scrub the surface, removing residue before cooking. The meat that emerged from this process was often tougher, smaller, and darker, but it was edible, and edible was enough. In a world where winter illness or predators waited at the edges of every decision, cooking served as the final assurance. Fire transformed the reclaimed meat into something safer, its heat destroying what their hands could not fully remove. In some regions, the method evolved slightly. Instead of letting flies approach freely, people placed thin skins or woven coverings over the meat, allowing insects to touch but not fully inhabit the flesh. This reduced risk and kept the process more contained. Even these small refinements reveal how early humans adapted constantly, altering their techniques with every encounter, every loss, every success. This method did more than provide food. It shaped attitudes toward the natural world. Humans learned that even the smallest creatures could influence their fate. They discovered that decay itself could be manipulated, not stopped, but redirected. In choosing to interact with parasites, they demonstrated a willingness to use whatever the environment offered, no matter how unsettling. Despite its dangers and distaste, the method endured in some places because it worked. It extended the life of food, just enough to bridge short periods when hunting failed. It allowed groups to salvage parts of animals that would otherwise be discarded. It taught them that survival required flexibility, even in the face of revulsion. Their willingness to rely on creatures born from decay revealed how far they were willing to bend nature to delay the loss of precious food. In coaxing insects to do part of their work, they pushed the boundaries of preservation into darker territory. The next shift in their struggle turned their attention from living creatures to forces of ice and cold that shaped entire landscapes. In the vast stretches of prehistoric cold lands, where wind swept across frozen ground and daylight carried little warmth, humans discovered that the harshness of their environment could be used to fight the decay that haunted their every position. Hunt. Snow and ice, though dangerous and unforgiving, offered something no other method could match: time. In these frozen regions, rot slowed almost to stillness. Meat remained firm, fish kept its shape, and the cold gripped everything tightly, delaying the changes that elsewhere unfolded within hours. Those who lived in these environments learned to carve their survival not from fire or minerals, but from the frozen earth itself. Snow was more than silence layered on the land. It became a refuge for their food. Hunters dug shallow pits in the drifts, lowering heavy cuts inside, then covering them with thick layers of powder that acted as a natural barrier. The cold surrounded the meat from all sides, drawing heat away with a steady pull that humans recognized through instinct rather than knowledge. They saw how the meat changed, how it stiffened, how its scent lessened, how insects could not reach it, and how decay, normally quick and merciless, moved reluctantly in this frozen world. The snow's embrace slowed what nothing else could. Caves carved by ancient ice became another form of preservation. These hollows, shaped by time and wind, held air so cold that breath condensed instantly. People stored fish and meat deep inside, where predators hesitated to follow, and where the temperature remained constant even on brighter days. These caves became silent guardians of stored food. Hunters marked their entrances with stones or bones, returning periodically to retrieve what remained untouched. It is somewhat darkly humorous that some of the deadliest landscapes offered their most reliable storage spaces, but cold did not eliminate danger. The smell of meat, even frozen, carried through the air in faint trails that certain animals followed with unrelenting persistence. Wolves, foxes, and bears learned to dig into snow where humans stored their food. A single night of vigilance lost could mean losing an entire cache. The struggle to keep food hidden did not end with the cold, it simply shifted. The environment offered preservation, but not protection. The weight of snow itself became both an advantage and an obstacle. Too much snow compressed the pits to the point where retrieving food became nearly impossible without exposing hands to freezing winds. Hunters used bone tools or sharpened stones to carve through icy layers, working with speed born from necessity. Fingers stiffened quickly, cold punished hesitation. Yet they endured because the reward, a meal preserved beyond the reach of time, was worth the suffering. Cold shaped behavior as surely as hunger did. People traveled shorter distances from their camps when burying their food, knowing that long journeys weakened them quickly. They selected storage spots shielded from sudden avalanches, places where the snow remained stable but accessible. They learned through loss and repetition which slopes were safe and which valleys invited disaster. In today's terms, the frozen earth served as a crude, unpredictable cold chamber that could preserve but also endanger anyone who approached it carelessly. I often think about the quiet rhythm of those early humans as they stored food in the ice. They moved with a mixture of caution and resignation, understanding that cold was both ally and enemy. I find it haunting to imagine them standing in silence at the mouth of an ice cave, trusting a darkness shaped by forces far older than themselves. Their breath drifted into the air as faint mist, their hands trembled, and yet they continued because the cold gave them something no fire ever could, months instead of days. The method also reflected the seasonality of their world. During the warmest moments of the year, the snow thinned, the ice became unstable, and food preservation required improvisation. They dug deeper, sought shaded cliffs, or buried their caches beneath layers of rock. Winter provided an abundance of cold, but summer threatened to undo everything. This cycle reinforced their understanding that preservation was not static. It shifted with the land and the seasons. The success of storing food in ice shaped their migrations. Groups followed patterns of freeze and thaw, mapping out territories where preservation was possible. They avoided regions where predators had learned to seek human caches. They left markers not only for themselves, but for others in their communities, passing down the knowledge through small, quiet gestures rather than spoken rules. Even with all its advantages, this method demanded constant vigilance. Snowstorms buried markers, thawing ice created dangerous pits, weakened ground collapsed beneath careless steps. Any mistake could destroy both food and life. Yet, generation after generation, people returned to the cold because it gave them a chance, a longer stretch of time, before decay reclaimed what they had worked so hard to obtain. In this world of ice and uncertainty, humans found a fragile balance. Their use of snow and caves did not merely preserve food, it preserved their future. They learned to read the land with a precision shaped by need, trusting the cold while fearing it, relying on a force that never softened for their sake. Their dependence on ice revealed how intimately they shaped their survival around the land's harshest features. In surrendering their food to the cold, they gained time that no other method had granted them. What followed next emerged, not from elements or creatures, but from the air itself, dry, thin, and moving across high places. Across many prehistoric landscapes where ground-level dangers were constant, and decay traveled quickly through warm air, humans turned their eyes upward. Trees, cliffs, and elevated branches became more than shelter or markers along a path. They became places where food could be lifted beyond the reach of teeth, claws, and swarms. Hanging meat high in the air was not just a defensive tactic. It was an early form of drying, shaped by height, wind, and patience. The ground consumed what touched it, but the air, dry, slow, and steady, offered a fragile form of protection. Hunters chose trees with thick branches strong enough to hold the weight of fresh kills. They stripped the meat into smaller sections, so the air could move through it freely, then bound the pieces with sinew or braided fibers. Each piece dangled above the earth, swaying slightly in the breeze. Below, insects gathered, but could not reach far. Predators paced, but found no footholds. The elevation created a small sanctuary, where time passed differently. Airflow was essential. In dry climates, wind acted as an invisible partner. It brushed along the surface of the hanging meat, slowly removing moisture without the intensity of the sun. The shade beneath branches kept the flesh from cooking prematurely, while the breeze reduced the humidity that encouraged decay. Humans noticed how the outer layer toughened first, creating a protective shell that delayed spoilage within. This shell was crude, uneven, and unpredictable, yet it bought them precious days. Tree drying was not a uniform practice. In forested areas, dense canopies trapped moisture, making drying slow and uncertain. In open lands, branches were scarce, forcing people to improvise with rock ledges or wooden frames. But wherever the technique appeared, the principle remained the same. Lift the food away from the ground, let the air pass through it, and trust that height would do what soil and fire sometimes could not. Animals, however, adapted quickly. Birds learned to perch near the dangling pieces, watching for moments of weakness. Small predators circled the base of trees, waiting for scraps or hoping for ropes to fail. Humans responded with greater care, choosing higher branches, reinforcing knots, and placing thorny branches around the trunks to slow climbers. It is almost darkly amusing how preservation became a contest between human patience and animal persistence. Drying in the air required long hours of quiet watching. People checked the meat by touch, feeling whether the surface had tightened or softened. They listened for the subtle hum of insects, approaching sensed changes in temperature or humidity, and shifted the meat if shadows lengthened or wind patterns changed. The method was simple, but success depended on attention. It demanded the same awareness they used in hunting. Only this time the enemy was invisible. The slow transformation of the flesh fascinated them. The color deepened, the texture changed, and the smell sharpened. Dried meat became lighter, easier to carry, and less susceptible to sudden spoilage. In modern terms, this resembles relying on a crude form of passive dehydration, powered only by air and time. It lacked precision, but it provided food that could last beyond a single day. I imagine the quiet moments beneath those trees, where the only movement came from pieces of meat turning gently in the wind. I find it striking how humans placed their trust in the same air that chilled them at night and dried their skins during long migrations. They understood that elevation meant safety, not perfect safety, but enough to survive. Children learned to watch the sky rather than the ground. They learned how clouds signaled changes that could ruin the drying process. Rain meant danger. Moisture revived decay instantly. Storm winds could tear down an entire rack within minutes. The method, useful as it was, remained fragile. It demanded vigilance not only from people, but from the land itself. In some regions, humans built drying frames from branches, creating elevated structures where meat could hang in rows. These frames stood like silent markers across open plains, reminders that survival required more than strength. It required adaptation. Such structures allowed them to dry larger quantities at once, supporting longer journeys or preparing for harsh seasons. But even with improvements, drying remained dependent on the weather. A single, humid day could undo hours of progress. A sudden predator attack could scatter days of effort. Yet people returned to the method again and again because it used the simplest resource available to them: air. No fire, no salt, no caves, just wind and height. This technique shaped migration patterns. Groups stayed longer in areas with favorable drying conditions. They chose routes with trees sturdy enough to support their frames. They mapped landscapes not only by water sources and prey movements, but by where the wind blew cleanest and strongest. The method endured because it expanded their sense of time. Dried meat could travel farther, last longer, and support more people. It turned a single hunt into sustenance that could stretch across days. In a world where scarcity was constant, this mattered more than comfort or taste. Their willingness to trust wind and height revealed how deeply they studied the quiet forces of their environment. In raising their food toward the air, they discovered a new way to slow the advance of decay. The shift that followed drew their attention downward again to the skins of the animals they hunted, transformed into the earliest containers for meat. For early humans living among shifting seasons and unpredictable terrain, preservation was never a matter of comfort but of survival. They learned slowly, by watching animals and by examining the remains of their own hunts, that the skin of a creature could continue serving a purpose long after its life had ended. Once scraped clean and softened, a hide did not merely offer warmth or shelter. It became a vessel capable of holding the most perishable parts of their hard-won food. Stuffed, tied, and lifted into safer spaces, these hide bundles formed one of the earliest attempts to seal meat away from the forces waiting to consume it. After a kill, the skin was removed with deliberate care. Hunters stretched it across stones or wooden stakes, scraping away fat and membrane until the surface grew smoother. When the hide reached the right consistency, not too stiff, not too damp, they folded it into crude pouches capable of holding pieces of meat. The flesh was pressed inside until the pouch bulged, and the opening was secured with sinew-twisted fibers or braided plant strands. Once tied, the hide formed a barrier thicker and more reliable than leaves or bark could ever offer. The goal was simple: keep air insects and predators away long enough for the group to move or to prepare fire. Air carried the first signs of decay. Insects introduced their eggs into vulnerable surfaces, and predators could smell exposed flesh long before humans realized danger was near. By sealing meat inside a hide, people bought themselves time, never much, but enough to matter. It is almost grimly amusing that the skin protecting an animal in life ended up protecting its meat in death. Some groups suspended these hide packages from branches, allowing them to sway above the damp ground. Others buried them beneath soil or snow, letting the earth's natural coolness surround the pouch. Elevation kept the scent from spreading too far. Burial softened the heat that encouraged decay. The method was flexible, which meant it could follow the group wherever they traveled. In places with little wind or too much humidity, the hide offered protection unmatched by drying alone. Still, this method demanded precision. A hide scraped too quickly retained grease that fed bacteria. One tied too loosely allowed insects in through narrow seams. One tied too tightly split under pressure, spilling its contents and attracting predators. People learned these lessons not through instruction but through repetition, loss, success, and memory, shaping their hands with each attempt. Over time, the work became instinctive. Predators were a constant threat. Wolves paced beneath, suspended hides knowing meat was inside but frustrated by the height. Bears dug at buried pouches, ripping into the soil with unstoppable strength. Even smaller animals gnawed at the edges, hoping for the slightest tear. Humans countered with strategy, tying pouches higher, burying them deeper, and surrounding storage spots with thorny branches or sharpened stakes. Viewed from today's perspective, these hide containers resemble primitive portable storage bags, whose reliability depended as much on caution as on construction. I often picture the slow, repetitive movements that defined this process: scraping, smoothing, tightening, lifting. Hunters worked with quiet concentration, aware that any mistake could cost them food they could not afford to lose. I find it striking how they placed trust in hides, even while knowing they were far from perfect. In their world, perfection was not required. Usefulness was enough. Inside the pouch, the meat often changed texture. With little airflow, moisture collected and softened its fibers. Sometimes fermentation began subtly producing stronger scents that some groups tolerated while others found unacceptable. Temperature, humidity, and geography dictated how long the hide protected its contents. In dry regions, the pouch remained stable longer. In damp ones, the meat spoiled more quickly. People checked regularly, untied the opening, inspected the color and smell, and decided whether the contents could remain stored or needed to be cooked immediately. Children watched these rituals and learned the steps early. They practiced scraping small hides, tying them and testing knots. They learned which parts of an animal produced the best containers and how to judge when a hide had been cleaned thoroughly. They learned to choose the right branches for suspending the pouches and the safest earth for burying them. Knowledge passed through silent observation long before words existed to describe preservation. These hide containers also allowed movement in a way that many other methods did not. While drying, smoking, or burying required people to stay close, sealed hides could travel. Hunters could carry them across valleys, up riverbeds, or through dense forests. The pouch became part of the journey, swinging gently from a staff or hanging from a pack. The longer the meat lasted, the farther the group could roam, which shaped both their migration patterns and their relationship to the land. Some groups improved on the method, coating the outside of the hide with clay to reduce scent or wrapping it in leaves for added insulation. Others pierced small openings in the pouch to allow moisture to escape gradually. These adaptations varied from place to place, each shaped by necessity and experimentation. Though imperfect, the method endured. It offered a trade effort in exchange for time vulnerability, in exchange for mobility. In a world where decay waited eagerly for any mistake, time and mobility were treasures beyond measure. Their use of hides as sealed containers revealed a willingness to reshape nature's remnants into tools for survival. Through these pouches, they preserved not just meat, but the freedom to move farther and endure longer. What followed next arose from a quieter transformation, one driven not by skins or wind, but by the slow, controlled processes of fermentation. Among the many ways early humans fought against the speed of decay, few were as strange, persistent, or quietly transformative as allowing meat to ferment inside sealed containers. This was not the deliberate, refined fermentation known in later civilizations. It was a crude, instinctive practice, shaped by cold seasons, limited fire, and the constant need to stretch every resource. When warmth was scarce and smoke was difficult to maintain, people turned to a process that unfolded slowly, hidden from sight, letting the meat change, soften and sour inside a closed pouch until it became something that could last longer than fresh flesh ever could. The method began after a hunt when temperatures dropped low enough for the meat to resist rapid rot. People packed pieces of flesh into tightly sealed hides or small pits lined with earth, pressing out air as best they could. Inside these makeshift containers, moisture and natural bacteria interacted with the meat. Days passed, then weeks. The smell intensified, growing sharp and heavy, a scent that clung to hands and tools. Yet those who relied on this method understood that strong odors did not always mean danger. In cold conditions, fermentation progressed slowly, reshaping the meat without destroying it. The texture changed first. Flesh softened, becoming easier to chew, even after long storage. The taste followed, pungent, sour, and distinct. This was not a flavor humans sought out as a pleasure, but as a necessity. For groups living in frigid regions with sparse firewood, fermentation offered a way to keep meat edible through difficult stretches. It is almost darkly humorous that what many today would reject on sight became a dependable resource during winter scarcity. Fermented meat required careful handling. Containers had to remain sealed, undisturbed by scavengers or shifting ground. Too much air ruined the process. Too little cold invited rot instead of controlled change. People checked the containers by pressing the surface or listening for faint shifts within signs known only to those who lived closely with the land's rhythms. When opened, the meat released a dense smell that filled the air, one that would have frightened outsiders but reassured those who knew the scent as survival. This method mattered most in regions where fire was unreliable. Storms drenched kindling, winds extinguished flames, and long nights drained energy. Fermented meat did not require cooking immediately, although many groups cooked it anyway to reduce risk. Others ate it, as it was relying on the cold to keep harmful growth at bay. In a modern perspective, this resembles trusting a naturally shifting food to remain safe inside a sealed environment that no one could fully observe. I often envision the quiet acceptance with which people approach these containers. I find it remarkable how hunger shaped tolerance, turning smells and textures into signals rather than warnings. They did not judge the meat by its appearance or its odor, but by their accumulated understanding of when the process had gone too far and when it remained within the edge of safety. Fermented meat became especially vital during migration. Hunters could not stop every night to build fires or search for dry wood. They carried pouches of partially fermented flesh tied to their belts or slung across their backs. The cold air slowed the process further, allowing them to travel without worrying that their food would spoil before reaching their destination. Children grew up recognizing the scent of this preserved meat as part of daily life, something as ordinary to them as dryness or wind. The method also reflected an early grasp of delayed transformation. Even without understanding bacteria or chemistry, people sensed that controlled enclosure brought change, sometimes dangerous, sometimes useful. They learned to distinguish between acceptable sourness and the warning signs of rot. They learned which animals fermented more cleanly, which cuts of meat endured longer, and which seasons supported the process best. This knowledge passed quietly between generations, accumulating like the slow fermentation itself. Hard winters pushed the method to its limits. When food ran low, even strongly fermented meat became valuable. Foul odors meant discomfort, but starvation meant death. People scraped away outer layers, boiled the remaining flesh, or combined fermented pieces with fresh meat to soften the intensity. Nothing was wasted. Even the liquids that gathered at the bottom of fermentation pits were sometimes boiled into broths, thin but sustaining. Despite its usefulness, the method carried constant risk. Containers damaged by predators exposed the meat too early. Sudden warm spells accelerated decomposition. A single misjudgment left entire stores inedible. Families endured sickness when fermentation slipped into rot, yet they continued using the method because alternatives were limited and dangerous in their own ways. The endurance of proto-fermentation shows how adaptable humans became when faced with scarcity. They learned not only to chase food, but to transform it subtly. The process blurred the line between preservation and change, between the living world and the quiet chemistry happening within a sealed pouch. For them, it was not innovation, it was necessity shaped into routine. Over time, some groups refined the technique by adding herbs, ash, or snow to slow or redirect the transformation. Others adjusted their containers, tightening some areas while loosening others to encourage controlled airflow. Small changes accumulated, creating variations across regions. But the essence remained the same. Trust the cold, trust the enclosure, trust the slow work happening beyond sight. Their use of fermentation revealed an acceptance of transformation as part of survival, not something to resist, but something to guide. In letting meat sour and soften in darkness, they claimed more days of life from every hunt. A later shift turned their attention toward the landscape itself, where certain plants offered unexpected help against the spread of decay. There were moments in prehistoric life when hunger pressed so sharply against the edges of survival that people were forced to reconsider what counted as food. Fresh kills did not last long, preserved cuts were never enough, and fire could fail in storms or harsh winters. When every safer method strained under the weight of scarcity, some groups turned to a practice that hovered uneasily between nourishment and danger. They learned to consume meat, not at its freshest, but at a stage where it had begun to soften, sour, and transform, when it had entered the early shadow of decay without collapsing fully into rot. This strange substance would later be called high meat, though those who relied on it knew only the urgency that shaped their choices. The process happened slowly. Hunters sealed pieces of meat inside hides, pits, or containers where air could not move freely. Temperature, moisture, and darkness changed the flesh day by day. As time passed, the meat loosened, fibers weakening as natural bacteria transformed its structure. The smell intensified, sinking into everything it touched, clinging to skin, tools, and air. Yet the people who used this method did not recoil. They watched for signs that the transformation had reached a stage they recognized, one that kept the meat from turning lethal while still offering something edible. It is almost bleakly amusing that the very qualities most people today would treat as red flags became, for some early groups, markers of readiness. High meat was never predictable. One batch developed slowly and safely. The next, under slightly different conditions, became poisonous. People learned to test it with senses sharpened by necessity, pressing the surface to feel its softness, smelling for the right balance between sourness and rot, noting the way the interior responded when pierced. These were judgments no tool could measure. Instinct, memory, and experience guided them, and mistakes were costly. When eaten, the meat produced effects unlike any other food. Some felt a strange clarity, a warming in their chest, or a wave of alertness. Others experienced nausea or dizziness. Groups interpreted these sensations according to their own beliefs. In colder climates where digestion slowed, the softened meat was valued for its supposed benefits. In some regions, families believed it aided the stomach, especially after long periods of limited food. Seen through modern eyes, the entire practice resembles consuming a volatile substance whose safety depended entirely on timing. I imagine the moment when a family opened a hide pouch that had been sealed for weeks. I find it unsettling, yet revealing that they leaned toward the smell instead of away from it, searching for signs that only their experience could decipher. The rising odor, thick and penetrating, would have overwhelmed anyone unaccustomed to it. But for them it spoke of survival, not comfort, not pleasure, but endurance. Some stored the meat underground, letting the cool earth slow the transformation. Others hung it away from predators, but sheltered from the sun, allowing the process to advance at a steady rhythm. In winter, fermentation slowed. In warmer seasons it raced. People adapted. They shifted containers, tasted small pieces, and learned to intervene when conditions drifted beyond their control. These adjustments formed a kind of primitive science built from countless quiet experiments. Failures left marks that shaped tradition. Meat left too long or stored too warm brought sickness or death. Families remembered which seasons were safest, which cuts spoiled fastest, and which containers held steady temperatures. Children heard warnings through stories when to avoid the process entirely, when the smell crossed the invisible threshold, when hunger did not justify the risk. Yet, in the hardest seasons, high meat returned because no other option stretched provisions as far. Most groups did not eat it raw. They mixed it with fresher cuts, boiled it, or scraped away the outermost layers before cooking. The aim was always the same: transform something unstable into something usable. Taste mattered little. Survival mattered entirely. And even with risks, the method endured because it allowed people to save food that would otherwise be lost. The practice also reflected the worldview of the people who used it. Decay was not an enemy to outrun entirely. It was a force that could be guided, slowed, redirected, or even used when conditions demanded it. Their understanding of food was not based on avoidance, but on negotiation, an ongoing dialogue with the natural processes shaping everything around them. Over time, the method shaped identity within certain groups. individuals skilled at judging meat became trusted figures responsible for decisions that influenced the fate of entire families. Their senses were tools as valuable as any blade. They carried knowledge that was both feared and respected, for it danced along the thin edge between sustenance and sickness. Risk in prehistoric life was constant. High meat did not introduce danger. It merely offered a different form of it, one that families accepted when circumstances tightened around them. They recognized that life seldom allowed perfect choices. Sometimes, survival meant eating what the living world had already begun to reclaim. Their reliance on high meat showed how far desperation could bend the rules of what humans considered edible. In stepping so close to the boundary of rot, they uncovered a harsh form of sustenance shaped by their own resilience. What waited afterward drew their attention to the leaves and bark of certain plants, where hidden properties quietly resisted decay. There were times in prehistoric life when humans sought protection not in the elements, nor in animals, nor in fire, but in the quiet strength of plants. Leaves, bark, and fibrous layers carried scents and oils that early groups did not understand, but sensed intuitively. When meat spoiled too quickly in warm air, when insects circled, or when other preservation methods faltered, people turned to the plants surrounding their camps. They pressed flesh against cool leaves, wrapped it in layers that clung tightly, or bound it with bark softened by water. Without realizing it, they were using natural antimicrobials long before such ideas had names. The discovery likely happened by chance. Hunters noticed that meat wrapped in certain leaves lasted longer than meat left bare. They saw that insects avoided some plants, even when drawn to the scent of blood. They observed that moisture evaporated more slowly when the leaves sealed the surface. Over time, these small advantages combined into a method that reshaped their relationship to the forest. It is strangely amusing that the plant's predators used only as shelter became for humans silent allies against decay. Not all plants worked. Some leaves wilted too quickly, trapping moisture and accelerating rot. Others imparted strong flavors that made the meat nearly inedible. A bark that seemed firm might crack, revealing the food inside to insects. Early groups learned through painful repetition which plants protected and which plants deceived. They learned which scents masked the smell of meat and which drew predators from miles away. Their knowledge, though unspoken, formed a map across the landscape, one built from leaves rather than territory lines. Leaves with natural oils performed best. When pressed against meat, their surfaces acted as barriers that slowed the invasion of bacteria. Bark stripped from trees with aromatic sap created a hard shielding layer once dried again. Fibrous stems wrapped tightly around the meat kept insects at bay. The method did not stop decay, it merely delayed it. But for people who counted time in hours rather than days, those delays mattered deeply. I imagine them gathering leaves early in the morning, selecting each one with focus. They washed the leaves in streams, laid them flat on stones, and placed the meat in the center. I find it compelling how humans trusted the forest, even without understanding its chemistry, sensing that certain plants carried protective power. They pressed the edges together, tied the bundle with grasses, and set it aside in shade where the cool air helped preserve its contents. Wrapped meat took on the characteristics of the plant, embracing it. Some leaves left earthy tones, others softened harsh smells. Bark imparted bitterness or sweetness, depending on the species. These changes shaped the earliest forms of flavor, though taste was never the priority. Survival overshadowed preference. Yet the influence of these choices lingered. Techniques that began as a necessity grew into habits, and habits evolved into traditions that eventually touched the food practices of later cultures. The forest, however, held dangers. Some plants were toxic. Leaves that worked well for fish ruined red meat. Bark that sealed one type of flesh caused another to spoil quickly. Hunters learned the limits the hard way. They learned that a plant's protective scent could also attract animals who recognized the smell of sap. They adapted again, layering different leaves, combining textures, experimenting with what their environment offered. In a modern lens, this method resembles using fragile, biodegradable packaging infused with natural preservatives. Certain plants even changed the texture of the meat. Their oils seeped inward, firming the surface or softening it, depending on the species. This added complexity to the method. Too much oil caused rapid spoilage, too little left the meat exposed. People developed techniques through touch, pressing the wrapped meat gently to test whether the leaf had begun to break down or whether the bark still held strong. In colder regions, The method worked in tandem with snow or cool caves. Plants protected the meat from direct ice, while the natural chill extended preservation. In warmer regions, shade became essential. Leaves dried out quickly, requiring people to replace them often. Plant-wrapped meat was sometimes hung from trees, combining this method with elevation for better protection. Mobility increased as well. People tied these bundles to belts or carried them in woven baskets, allowing them to travel without exposing the meat to the open air. Children were introduced to the method early. They learned which leaves to avoid, which bark cracked too easily, and which plants kept insects away. They imitated adults practicing wrapping stones or sticks before graduating to real food. Knowledge passed quietly, shaped not by explanation, but by repetition. Plant wrapping reflected a deeper connection between humans and the landscape. In every leaf and strip of bark, they saw not just shelter or fuel, but potential. They recognized that the world around them held solutions they could not fully explain. The method endured because it required little, no fire, no tools, and no rare minerals. Only awareness, patience, and a familiarity with the land. Even in failure, this method taught them something. Spoiled bundles reminded them which plants broke down too quickly or which areas of the forest were too humid. Successes reinforced patterns that would eventually influence the earliest forms of cooking, seasoning, and storing food. Their use of antimicrobial plants revealed a willingness to seek protection in the smallest elements of the natural world. In wrapping their food in leaves and bark, they borrowed quite a strength from the forest to slow decay. A shift then carried their attention toward a heavier barrier, drawn from the bodies of the very animals they hunted. They learned early that warmth could destroy food, but it could also provide an unexpected shield when used carefully. When hunters returned with heavy carcasses during the colder months, the group knew the meat would not last long unless something stronger than shade or dry air protected it. So they began to melt animal fat in crude vessels, heating it slowly until it turned liquid, thick, and shimmering under the firelight. The scent was heavy, clinging to their hands and hair, but it signaled a kind of safety they could not obtain from the raw meat alone. Once the fat reached a warm, fluid state, it was poured over pieces of meat tightly packed in small pits or containers lined with hide. When it cooled, the fat solidified into a dense, pale shell that sealed everything inside, shutting out the air that quickened decay. This method was not born from theory or ritual, but from simple observation. They noticed that scraps forgotten under hardened grease near cooking fires seemed unchanged even after days. They tasted the fragments cautiously, expecting illness, but finding them edible, even stable. That small discovery grew into a habit, and that habit evolved into a technique. Over many seasons, they refined the way they rendered the fat, learning how long to heat it, so impurities would settle, or how to keep embers alive through long nights when the melting took hours. The work demanded patience and an unbroken focus. Anyone careless enough to spill the liquid fat paid with burns that lingered for weeks. Rendered fat worked because it suffocated the meat beneath, blocking moisture in the air and slowing the work of invisible rot. They did not understand the forces involved, but they could feel the difference when they opened a container sealed days earlier. The meat smelled firm, strengthened by cold and confinement, rather than ruined by it. Winter villages welcomed this technique more than others, because the surrounding cold helped the fat harden quickly, forming a stronger barrier. The timing mattered. Pouring fat over warm meat, or storing it too early in the season, often created pockets where air was trapped, turning preservation into a slow disaster. During harsh winters, this method often meant survival. When storms sealed, cave entrances, or heavy winds made hunting impossible, they relied on these fat-encased reserves to provide nourishment. The first cuts were always the thickest, hard to break through, but rewarding once the protective layer cracked away from the preserved flesh. Children learned the sound of it, a dull fracture beneath cold fingers, signaling that there was something left to eat. Their elders remembered years when such stores were the only thing standing between endurance and freezing hunger. Yet even in these moments, the taste could remind them of how precariously they lived. Meat soaked in fat carried a heaviness, a reminder of long nights by fires and the constant threat of losing what little they had. Despite its value, the technique bore risks. Rancid fat could turn the entire store inedible, and once the smell spread, nothing could be saved. They had to watch the color of the fat, listen to elders speak of seasons, when animals grew too lean for proper melting, and avoid mixing fat from sick prey. These decisions were rarely clear, forcing them to trust instincts built from years of failure and uncertain success. It was common for groups to lose entire reserves because of one misjudgment, especially during warm spells when the fat softened unexpectedly. They would awaken to find the protective shell collapsing, its promise broken, and the food beneath already shifting into decay. Still, compared to other methods, this one offered the most reliable protection in long winters. It required no special terrain, no sunlight, and no seasonal luck, only fire patience and the willingness to use every part of the animal they hunted. The technique also shaped how they organized their shelters. Areas set aside for food storage were chosen carefully away from animals, near steady, cold patches, and close enough to fires that fat could be melted and poured without long travel. Awkward as it seemed, these spaces became central to their survival, silent witnesses to decisions that determined whether a family endured the darkest months. Over time, sealing meat in fat became more than an emergency tactic. It became a form of planning. Hunters measured their success not by what they ate immediately, but by how much they could protect for later. They tallied portions mentally, deciding which parts would be eaten fresh, which dried, and which sealed in fat. Such calculations kept them alive, though they never spoke of them with any sense of pride. Planning was simply another shadow in their daily existence, shaped more by fear of loss than by any dream of comfort. When strangers passed through, they often remarked on the strange cold-set blocks stored along the walls. Visitors sometimes refused to eat from them, disturbed by the thick casing and its quiet stillness. But hunger softened objections quickly. They learned, as others had, that the layer of hardened fat was not a warning, only a boundary between them and the greater emptiness of starvation. Their reliance on solidified fat revealed how survival often depended on sealing life away from the air that tried to claim it. In turning melted grease into a shield, they created quiet pockets of safety for the harshest months. Further efforts pushed them toward colder waters, where moving currents offered yet another way to delay the reach of decay. Cold water often revealed possibilities that dry land could not offer. Hunters moving through the valleys noticed that the remnants of fish caught between stones stayed firm much longer than meat, kept in baskets or laid out in shaded pits. The streams were never still. Even in warmer months, currents pressed through narrow channels with a chill that clung to the skin. That steady cold became something worth studying, especially when every attempt to store food above ground left them fighting insects' heat and the sharp noses of predators. Rot worked faster than their bodies could recover from a failed hunt, and so the search for a slower kind of decay naturally led them toward the water. Early attempts were rough and full of mistakes. Pieces of meat placed at the edge of a stream disappeared within hours, drawn away by the pull of moving water. Other portions were torn open by animals that followed the scent downstream. Wrapping the meat was the first lesson. Hide scraped clean layers of bark, pressed tight or dense grass, bound with cordage. These coverings were not meant for keeping things clean, but for keeping them from drifting away. Stones were tied to the bundles, their weight adjusted again and again, until the hunters found the point where the current held the food in place, without burying it beyond reach. Small discoveries shaped the technique. Deep springs hidden under shelves of rock kept their temperature throughout the year colder than the air above. Bends in the river where the current narrowed created strips of water cold enough to numb the fingers within seconds. Submerging meat in these places slowed the softening that normally began soon after a kill. They saw that less air meant less spoilage, though they understood nothing about the unseen process behind it. For them, the logic was simple: water that stayed cold and kept moving, preserved life a little longer. But every gain came with a risk. Even tightly wrapped bundles released traces of scent. Wolves and bears, always attentive to the riverbanks, learned to circle the same places where humans returned. Tracks pressed into wet sand told the story clearly enough. Food stored in water attracted other hungry creatures. This forced quiet behavior, careful steps, and constant watching. Storage sites had to be far from animal paths, yet close enough for daily access. A single misjudgment meant losing precious food or encountering a predator drawn by instinct stronger than hunger. In the coldest seasons, the method became more intricate. Ice formed at the edges of streams, sometimes closing the surface entirely except for narrow openings. The hunters cracked small holes, slid wrapped bundles into the dark water beneath, and sealed the openings with flat stones. Beneath the ice, the current still moved slowly, guarding the meat from sunlight and maintaining a chill that acted as nature's own barrier against rot. Sometimes the bundles froze into new layers of ice, requiring careful chiseling to free them. Yet this was still better than leaving meat exposed to the brittle air, where freezing cracks and thawing hours created their own problems. The method demanded constant attention. Floods could lift stones and sweep everything away. Heavy rains clouded the water, loosening bindings and softening the wrappings. Animals sometimes managed to tear through the coverings, scattering the contents before the hunters even realized something had changed. Nothing stored in water was ever secure. It was only suspended in time, waiting to be retrieved before the river reclaimed it. Still, the benefit outweighed the risk. Even a single extra day of preservation could mean an extra day of strength, and strength determined whether the next hunt ended with meat or with exhaustion. Knowledge was passed quietly. Younger members watched elders test the current with their hands, trace the lines of drifting leaves, and choose stones heavy enough to anchor, but light enough to lift. They learned which parts of the river ran coldest, which cracks in the rock held bundles safely, and which seasons demanded extra caution. No formal teaching existed, but repetition carved lessons into memory. Every group carried its own variation of the method shaped by the landscape and by the small discoveries made during desperate times. Inside their shelters, the presence of submerged food provided a muted comfort. Fires could burn, low winds could rise, and hunting paths could empty, yet the current continued moving. Somewhere beneath the surface, a bundle waited, cool, quiet, protected, just enough to buy them time. They relied on that time. It gave room to breathe in an existence defined by scarcity. Even if the river claimed a bundle now and then, the method still served as a reminder that survival did not always come from strength. Sometimes it came from placing trust in the cold and the movement that never stopped. Streams shaped the rhythms of their days. Checking the bundles at dawn, adjusting stones and clearing debris, these tasks became as natural as preparing tools or tending fire. The water, indifferent yet reliable, offered a narrow path between hunger and endurance. They did not thank it, but they respected it, understanding that each current carried away the warmth that tried to claim their food too soon. Using cold water showed how survival often depended on finding moments where decay moved more slowly than hunger. By trusting the current to guard their food, they borrowed time from a force they could not control. Soon their attention shifted toward the heat, trapped beneath cooling ashes, where another short-lived refuge against rot waited to be used. Warm ash often lingered long after the flames had collapsed into a faint red glow. In many camps, the fire pit became more than a place for heat or cooking. It served as a quiet repository, where the remains of burned wood formed a soft and powdery layer that held warmth through the night. Hunters and gatherers, who circled close to the dying embers, noticed that small scraps of meat, dropped accidentally into the ash, did not spoil as quickly as those left upon stone or soil. The mixture of heat, dryness, and partial shielding from insects created a narrow opportunity, brief but meaningful, for preserving food when no other method was available. Ash was accessible because fire was constant. Each evening flames were fed with branches, splintered logs, and dry grasses. By dawn the camp looked different, the fire's crackling voice gone, replaced by a mound of grey powder threaded with faint traces of heat. When a hunt ended late, or exhaustion made further preparation impossible, this ash became a refuge for whatever food remained uncooked. The process did not require tools. Hands pushed the powder aside, placed the meat within the warmed hollow, and then covered it lightly. The heat was gentle, nothing like cooking. It was the kind that slowed the stiffening of flesh and blocked the earliest signs of souring. The protective value of ash emerged slowly through observation. Insects, normally quick to arrive, hesitated around the warmth. Flies avoided surfaces that carried the scent of burned wood, perhaps confused by the shifting temperatures or discouraged by the dryness. Larger scavengers approached cautiously. Warm ash masked the smell of fresh meat, blending it with the lingering odor of fire. At a distance, predators detected nothing unusual, giving the group a short window free from disturbance. This mattered deeply during seasons, when spoiling could begin in only a few hours. Despite this usefulness, the method was fragile. Ash could cool rapidly during wind or rain. A sudden gust, a drizzle, or an accidental disturbance from a passing footstep scattered the powder, exposing the hidden food to air and insects. Hunters learned to choose the right moment, burying food only when the ash still held enough warmth to create a protective environment. They also learned to avoid burying too close to pockets of glowing ember, where heat might unexpectedly rise and cook the meat unevenly. or burn the outer layers. Balance was everything: enough warmth to delay rot, but not enough to transform the meat entirely. On colder nights, ash retained more heat. Some groups began to rely on this method for the earliest hours after a hunt, especially when travel was required. Meat buried in warm ash could be carried the next morning with less fear of spoilage. The technique bought them just enough time to reach cooler ground, flowing water, or shaded pits where longer storage became possible. It was a temporary solution, a bridge between the moment of the kill and the moment of preparation. Yet even such a small extension of time made a difference in lives where missteps quickly led to hunger. The preparation itself carried a kind of ritual rhythm, though no words marked it. Hunters brushed aside the top layer of ash feeling with their hands to locate pockets of still lingering heat. Meat was placed carefully wrapped in hide or grass to keep the powder from clinging too tightly. Once covered, the mound looked like nothing more than part of the fire's remains. Only those who had buried food there knew what waited beneath the soft grey surface. The method demanded attentiveness. The ash could not be left untouched for too long, and the meat had to be retrieved before the heat fully vanished. A delay of hours sometimes shifted the balance from preservation to loss. Predators occasionally discovered the hidden food. Claw marks around fire pits told the story of bears or wolves that had learned to associate ash with human activity. Because of this, camps rarely reused the same pit for long-term storage, preferring to vary the burial spots or shift the fire's location slightly after each night. Even so, the risk never fully disappeared. Each time food was buried, hunters kept watch at silent intervals, scanning the edges of darkness for shapes that moved with intent. The practice offered more than just extra hours of preservation. It reflected an ongoing effort to work with the environment rather than against it. Ash created a small, unstable shelter for food, one that existed only for a short time before becoming useless. But during those fleeting hours, it shielded the harvest of their labor. This fragile protection echoed a larger truth of their lives. Nothing was guaranteed, yet survival often depended on recognizing value in places others might overlook. Generations learned from the subtle cues of ash. The warmth felt beneath fingertips, the dryness that clung to skin, the shifting smell of burned wood all guided them. These signs told them when to bury food, when to retrieve it, and when the method was no longer safe. The knowledge grew quietly, carried forward, without ceremony, shaped entirely by experience. Using warm ash showed how even the remains of a dying fire could hold back decay for a brief moment. In trusting that warmth, they bought hours of safety that often mattered more than anyone realized. Cooling embers soon pushed their attention towards stone and shadow, where hidden spaces offered yet another way to protect what they could not afford to lose. Nature often supplied containers long before humans understood the concept of storage. Scattered across the ground, broken eggshells gleamed faintly beneath leaves. Hollow bird bones lay abandoned after predators had taken their fill. Lengths of bamboo or reed stood firm near rivers, their interiors smooth and naturally divided. These objects were not crafted by human hands, yet their shapes carried possibilities. For groups who moved often and had little time to shape tools, such found forms became vessels that extended the life of whatever meat or fat they could spare. A cracked eggshell might seem too fragile to use, but the thicker shells of certain birds could hold small amounts of rendered fat, marrow, or dried shreds of meat. Hunters noticed that these shells, once rinsed in water or wiped with leaves, kept insects away better than exposed surfaces. The curve of the shell trapped scent and limited contact with air. It was not much, but in a world where every hour counted, even this slight shield offered a meaningful pause against decay. Hollow bones offered a different kind of protection. Their smooth inner chambers allowed small strips of dried meat or softened fat to be pushed inside. Once filled, the ends could be sealed with clay, resin, or tightly packed fibers. The shape made carrying easier. Bones slid into bundles, nestled among hides, or hung at the edges of walking sticks. These containers did not advertise the scent of food, and predators often passed them by, without noticing what had been hidden inside. For people constantly on the move, the convenience mattered as much as the preservation itself. Bamboo and reed brought the technique to a larger scale. When cut at natural joints, these plants formed hollow cylinders with only one open end. The interiors stayed cool and shaded, and their walls resisted insects more effectively than grass or hide. Hunters placed small amounts of food into these cylinders, packed them securely, and then plugged the openings with clay or wooden stoppers. Once tied shut, the cylinders could be slung over shoulders or lashed to carrying frames. The lightweight nature of bamboo made it ideal for long travels, especially when the group crossed open plains where shade was scarce. Suspension provided another layer of safety. Bundles hung from branches, or simple frameworks of tied wood, remained out of reach of many animals. Elevation allowed air to flow around the containers, drying small amounts of moisture and slowing the spread of bacteria. The ground, always a point of contact with insects and scavengers, became less of a threat. In camps where predators approached boldly at night, the height brought additional moments of warning. The technique also simplified daily routines. Containers remained visible, evenly spaced, and easy to inspect each morning. Movement shaped every decision. Groups traveling from one valley to another carried only what they could lift, and natural containers fit well into this pattern. Eggs, bones, and bamboo required no crafting time. They were used when available and discarded when emptied. There was no burden of maintenance, no need to repair, no fear of losing something precious. Nature provided replacements everywhere. A bird's nest left abandoned, a broken winged creature at the forest edge, or a cluster of bamboo beside a river. This flexibility gave the technique its value. Storage was not a fixed structure. It was something improvised, adjusted, and rebuilt each time the landscape changed. Even so, the method held risks. Bones cracked when dropped or stepped on. Eggshells shattered beneath careless hands. Bamboo splits when exposed to heat, or when the fibers dry too quickly. And whenever a container broke, the food inside lost its protection and began decaying almost immediately. The hunters compensated by dividing their stores across many vessels. If one failed, the rest remained usable. This fragmentation proved useful in another way. Scattered containers were harder for predators to detect or steal in a single strike. Moisture remained an obstacle. Though natural containers slowed decay, they were not airtight. Rain or river spray could seep inside, softening the food and accelerating spoilage. This forced the groups to position their hanging bundles beneath overhangs, tree canopies, or crude shelters of branches. Seasoned hunters learned to inspect each container by weight and scent, checking for subtle changes that signaled a breach or the beginning of rot. The routine became as familiar as maintaining a fire or sharpening a tool. These techniques also changed how the group interacted with the landscape. Searching for containers meant studying terrain closely, noting which birds nested where, which bones weathered slowly, and which streams produced bamboo with thick, reliable walls. Observation sharpened instincts that later shaped more advanced forms of storage. The mind began linking place with possibility, understanding not only what to take from the land, but how the land itself could shape survival. The process, though simple, reflected creativity under pressure. Nothing about these containers was permanent, yet they extended life long enough to matter. Food carried inside them remained protected during hunts, migrations, storms, and unexpected delays. For early humans with no knowledge of preservation beyond immediate necessity, the ability to transport food safely reshaped the boundaries of how far they could travel and how long they could endure. Using the natural shapes of eggshells, bones, and bamboo showed how survival often came from recognizing value in fragments scattered across the land. In trusting these fragile vessels, they created small pockets of safety where decay moved more slowly than hunger. A darker refuge soon occupied their thoughts as well, hidden within stone chambers where cool air lingered long after the sun disappeared. Limestone formations rose quietly across many ancient landscapes, shaped by slow water and deep time. Beneath these ridges, narrow openings led into chambers where daylight seldom reached, and the air held a steady coolness that did not shift with the sun. Early groups moving across harsh terrain learned to approach such places cautiously. Some caves were cramped, others opened suddenly into wide rooms with uneven ground, but nearly all shared conditions that slowed decay, dryness, stable temperature, and shadows that kept insects away. For people who needed even a few more days of preservation, these spaces became silent allies. Reaching the caves was rarely simple. Entrances often hid behind thick vegetation, tumbled rock, or steep slopes that demanded careful movements. The difficulty, however, worked in their favor. Predators prowling the lowlands did not always climb to these places, and scavengers following scent trails often failed to reach the narrow openings. The height created distance, and distance created safety. What was hard for humans to reach was even harder for four-legged intruders who relied on open ground and familiar paths. Inside, the air changed immediately. Warm breath condensed faintly in the cool chambers, and footsteps muted against powdery stone. Unlike shelters built from branches or hides, caves remained unaffected by wind or heat, and this stability made them useful. Meat wrapped in hide, dried strips hanging from cords or bones filled with marrow, could be placed along the inner walls where dryness held steady. Moisture rarely gathered there, and sunlight so often, a trigger for rapid spoilage, never touched the stored food. Even a single day of such conditions was precious. These caves became repositories not by design but by discovery. Hunters paused during long journeys, leaving bundles behind to lighten their loads. Gatherers placed nuts or roots on stone shelves where insects could not easily climb. Families traveling between seasonal grounds tucked small amounts of food into alcoves, marking the spot with stones or notches for later return. Over time, these hidden stores grew in number, each acting as a quiet promise that hunger could be delayed if the group retraced its steps. Secrecy played a role as well. Food left in the open risked attracting rival groups or opportunistic animals. Caves concealed these stores from plain sight, making them useful places for reserves meant to be retrieved only in moments of scarcity. Even groups that wandered widely maintained awareness of certain cave systems, mapping them mentally, knowing which were too damp, too unstable, or too heavily populated by bats or birds. The most reliable caves became part of a silent network of survival points scattered across the land. But dangers persisted. Some caves sheltered predators resting from the heat, and the darkness made detection difficult. Hunters often tossed pebbles inside before entering, listening for subtle shifts in the echoes. Even those caves deemed safe sometimes contained loose stones or narrow passages that forced crawling movements that left little room for escape if danger appeared. The effort of reaching these chambers was accepted because the reward, though temporary, could sustain the group in lean periods. Dryness remained the key advantage. Unlike water storage or ash burials, which required constant monitoring, cave deposits changed slowly. Flesh hardened rather than softened, fat solidified rather than melted, and the absence of insects reduced the speed of decay. Some groups even experimented with placing food near natural drafts that carried cool air through the cave, creating a crude form of circulation that helped maintain conditions. It was not deliberate engineering, merely observation layered over time, but it worked well enough for their needs. The cave walls sometimes bore marks of repeated use: charcoal stains from torches, scratches from carrying frames, or shallow impressions where bundles had once rested. These traces did not form a story, yet they reflected lives returning again and again to the same protective hollows. Young members of the group learned to recognize these signs. They understood that the cave held no guarantees, only opportunities shaped by attention and caution. During migrations, caves served as checkpoints. If food remained inside, the group continued forward with renewed confidence. If the stores had been disturbed or carried off by animals, by rivals, or by time, they adjusted their pace, knowing the next days would be harder. Survival depended not only on skill, but on anticipating how the land might change between visits. Caves, though dependable, were never fully trustworthy. They were only pockets of slowed decay within a world that constantly worked against preservation. Still, returning to a cave and finding food intact gave a rare sense of quiet triumph. The cool air brushed against the skin, the stored bundles felt firm, and the knowledge that earlier efforts had succeeded offered a moment of reassurance. In lives shaped by uncertainty, such moments held real weight. The cave did not provide abundance, but it provided time, and time was the most valuable resource of all. Hidden chambers, difficult passageways, and steady darkness turned these limestone spaces into unspoken partners in human endurance. By using them, early groups expanded their range, survived poor hunting seasons, and built patterns of movement that echoed across generations. The land carved the caves, but the people gave them purpose. Using limestone caves showed how survival often depended on finding pockets of stillness where the world's harsher forces moved more slowly. In trusting those sheltered interiors, they added another fragile layer of protection to their food supply. Further understanding emerged when they turned their attention toward dividing what they had rather than hiding it. Scarcity shaped decisions long before abundance ever appeared in human history. When early groups returned from a hunt, the sight of fresh meat created a brief sense of relief, but that relief always carried an undercurrent of calculation. Every piece held a different fate. Some would spoil quickly, some would last a little longer, and some would need to be eaten immediately to avoid loss. The understanding that food should never remain in large, unguarded amounts evolved slowly, shaped by countless moments when excess turned to waste. Dividing food into smaller portions became less a strategy and more a quiet rule stitched into the rhythm of survival. Rot moved unpredictably. A large cut, even if kept in shade, often spoiled from the inside before anyone realized. Insects found openings, moisture seeped in, and warmth settled beneath thick layers of flesh. Smaller cuts behaved differently. Air touched their edges. Heat escaped more easily. Insects struggled to invade deeply. Through repeated observation, hunters recognized that a single animal could not be treated as one whole supply. Breaking it apart, bought time and time, was the only protection they could create with their hands alone. The initial division often happened at the edge of the kill site. Bones, joints, and tendons provided natural lines that guided the butchering process. Once separated, the portions were carried back to camp in hides or simple slings. At the camp, the group spread out the pieces on clean stone surfaces, inspecting each one for density, softness, and exposure. The softer parts, especially organs, were eaten quickly. These pieces spoiled within hours, even in cold seasons. The tougher cuts, shoulders, legs, strips from the back, were placed aside for later use, or processed through drying, smoking, or burying in ash. By breaking the animal into sections, the group limited the number of pieces exposed at any one time. A small cut could be checked easily for signs of early spoilage. Any piece turning sour could be discarded without sacrificing the entire supply. This prevented the cascading waste that sometimes occurred when large portions were stored without attention. The method reduced risk in a landscape where food sources fluctuated unpredictably. Smaller portions also helped control how much was eaten. Hunger often pushed people to take more than needed, fearing tomorrow's scarcity. Yet consuming too much in one moment left nothing for later, especially during seasons when hunting success came in uneven bursts. By separating food into individual bundles or strips, the group created natural boundaries. Each bundle represented a single meal or half a meal. Eating one did not tempt them to consume others unnecessarily, because the act of opening a new portion required intent, not impulse. Children learned this early. They watched adults measure out meals with careful hands, ensuring that no piece was wasted. They saw that the first pieces chosen were always those most likely to spoil. This taught them urgency, without panic, caution, without fear. The routine became its own form of discipline, not enforced by words, but by the unspoken understanding that survival depended on pacing. This approach also supported travel. A handful of smaller pieces weighed less awkwardly than one heavy slab of meat. Hunters could tie portions to belts or packs, redistributing weight across the group. Small pieces dried faster when hung near a fire, reducing moisture efficiently. When moving through dense forest or rocky terrain, this flexibility prevented exhaustion, allowing the group to maintain a steady pace without sacrificing food quality. But the practice carried risks of its own. Small pieces attracted insects more openly. Flies landed quickly, leaving larvae in the soft tissues. To counter this, portions were kept covered with leaves, hide, or ash. Some groups placed them on elevated racks, where air circulated more freely. Others tucked the pieces beneath cool stones and checked them frequently. Attention had to remain constant. Any lapse could undo hours of careful preparation. The method also shaped how the group viewed abundance. A large kill no longer meant celebration without limit. It meant work sorting, cutting, and prioritizing. The moment of excitement after a successful hunt gave way to quiet concentration. The larger the animal, the more divisions required. Waste became a measure of failure, not inevitability. In this way, the practice of dividing and eating gradually created a mindset of restraint grounded in necessity. Even in lean times, the same principles applied. When hunting yielded only small prey, the portions remained small, but were treated with the same deliberate pace. One piece eaten, now one saved for later, and one processed for storage if possible. This rhythm prevented panic during scarcity. So long as even a little food remained, the group could maintain a plan, slow their consumption, and stretch their supplies across days or weeks. Observations from different landscapes reinforced the importance of the method. In warm climates, division protects against rapid decay. In cold climates, smaller cuts froze more evenly. In coastal regions, dividing fish into thinner strips allowed saltwater rinsing, which slowed softening. Across environments, the same principle held. Spreading risk created resilience. Over generations, the practice became instinctual. No single teacher carried the knowledge. The land itself taught it through consequence. Those who ignored the lesson suffered losses. Those who followed it endured more reliably. Eating gradually was not a choice rooted in discipline, but in the steady pressure of survival. Dividing food revealed how endurance often depended on preventing excess from turning into loss. In pacing their consumption, they shaped a quiet barrier between hunger and waste. New understanding appeared as they learned to combine multiple techniques into one shifting system of preservation. Survival in early landscapes rarely depended on a single solution. Each environment shifted from day to day, heat rising with little warning, storms collapsing, shelter predators altering their paths, and insects multiplying in sudden bursts. Because no single preservation method worked under all conditions, groups gradually learned to merge several techniques, creating layered protection for their food. This approach did not emerge from planning, but from necessity tested repeatedly, as the land revealed how quickly meat could slip beyond their control. A piece of meat hung from a branch dried faster when smoke drifted beneath it. Hunters noticed that strips exposed to both wind and smoke hardened evenly, forming outer surfaces that resisted insects and held their shape for days. The combination turned two fragile methods into a more stable system. Drying alone required constant sun. Smoking alone required long hours and careful tending of the fire. But together, they supported one another. Wind carried moisture away, while smoke brought compounds that slowed decay. This dual process became common in camps, where wind and fire could be managed without interruption. Hides offered another layer of protection. Wrapping food in scraped and dried skins limited exposure to air and insects. When smoke passed around these bundles, the hides absorbed part of its scent and heat, reinforcing the shield. Bundles hung in shaded areas gained the benefits of drying, while avoiding direct sunlight, which sometimes warmed the meat unevenly. The layers hide, wind, and smoke created an improvised envelope that extended the life of valuable pieces the group could not afford to lose. Certain landscapes encouraged more complex combinations. In colder regions, stones cooled overnight and held their temperature long after sunrise. Hunters used these stones as a foundation, setting wrapped bundles on them before layering plant leaves over the top. The leaves provided mild antimicrobial effects. The stones provided cold, and smoke drifting through camp added a third layer that touched each bundle without direct handling. Meat protected in this manner resisted softening longer than when placed in any single condition. In wetter regions, soil and mud became unexpected allies. Mud coated around a hide-wrapped bundle insulated it from air and insects, acting as a temporary barrier. When combined with leaves that released natural oils, the mud sealed in the compounds, preventing early spoilage. Groups used these coated bundles along riverbanks, letting cold water pass nearby without direct contact. The mud prevented washing away, while the environment delivered cooling. It was a delicate balance. If the mud was too thick, retrieval became difficult. If too thin, insects breached it easily. Flexibility became central to the technique. No camp could rely on one arrangement every season. When storms approached, drying racks were lowered and replaced with storage beneath stones or within shallow pits. When wind failed, smoke took a more prominent role. When predators stalked woodland edges, bundles were moved higher, lashed to branches, or suspended between trees with twisted fibers. The constant adjustments reflected a deeper truth. The preservation was never static, but always reacting to the pressures of the moment. Young members of the group learned to read these changes with care. They watched elders test wind direction, with small bits of grass touchstones to judge temperature, examine leaves for signs of fungal growth, and check hides for thinning or cracking. Each observation shaped the daily decision of which methods to combine. If the sun was strong, drying took precedence. If the air was damp, smoking became essential. If insects swarmed, hides or leaves were added. This blending of approaches created resilience in a world where no single technique could guarantee success. Failure often reinforced the learning. A bundle too close to the fire became tough and brittle. A hidden piece coated in mud, but left too long, gained a sour scent that warned the group away. Sometimes predators discovered suspended bundles, despite their height, tearing through the hide and scattering strips across the ground. Every loss carried a lesson about limits, how far each technique could be stretched, and how quickly a miscalculation could undo hard-earned efforts. But when the combinations worked, the results were striking. Food lasted longer, travel became easier, and the group gained more freedom in choosing when to hunt again. They were no longer tied immediately to the cycle of kill and consume. Preserved food allowed movement toward better water sources, safer shelter, or new foraging grounds without fear of immediate hunger. It was not abundance, but it was control, a small shift that gave shape to larger changes in how groups planned their lives. This approach also created a sense of shared responsibility. Preservation required coordination, someone tending the fire, someone watching the drying racks, someone checking the bundles at the tree line. The effort connected the group's actions, and each person's attention contributed to the fragile success. One failure could ripple outward, but one careful adjustment could stretch their supplies through difficult weeks. The land itself guided their choices. Plains, forests, river valleys, mountains all demanded different combinations. What worked in one environment failed in another. Through this constant negotiation with the natural world, people learned to shape responses rather than expect consistency. Preservation became an ongoing conversation with the landscape, answered through tools made not of metal or containers, but of wind, smoke, stone, and instinct. Blending methods revealed how survival often depended on building many small protections rather than trusting a single one. In layering these fragile techniques, they created a shifting shield against hunger. A final turn in understanding appeared when they looked back across generations and saw how these practices shaped the earliest traditions of food keeping. Across early landscapes, countless attempts to slow decay accumulated into a quiet inheritance. No single technique dominated. Instead, generations absorbed fragments of knowledge from daily struggle, bits of insight taken from ash, stone, wind, cold water, and plant oils. Over time, these fragments deepened into practices recognizable as the earliest forms of fermentation and drying. They did not emerge from deliberate study, but from long observation under pressure, shaped not by curiosity, but by survival. The land guided the people, and the people carried these lessons forward without ceremony. Drying, the simplest method, became one of the most enduring. Thin strips hung near fire pits hardened until brittle, their moisture drawn out by heat and air. This change was more than preservation. It created food that could withstand movement, storms, and weeks of scarcity. Generations repeated this pattern until it became an instinctive act. After each hunt, some meat was eaten fresh, some processed immediately. The rhythm created a small buffer against hunger, a cycle that gave shape to the earliest sense of planning beyond the present moment. Fermentation emerged, not from intention but from necessity. When meat or fish stored in tightly bound containers softened and changed scent, people learned to taste cautiously. Some of these transformed foods proved edible, even energizing, especially in cold seasons when fires burned low or wood ran scarce. What began as an accident grew into a recognizable process. Groups learned which wrappings, which temperatures, and which durations created tolerable results. The flavor was sharp, sometimes overwhelming, yet it carried nutrition during periods when fresh hunting was impossible. These two methods, drying and controlled spoilage, held qualities that exceeded all others. They did not require steady fire, cold water, or specific landscapes. They adapted to deserts, forests, coasts, and mountain valleys. This versatility allowed them to pass easily from one generation to the next. A child watching elders hang fish on a branch absorbed the lesson without words. A young hunter tasting fermented scraps during winter carried the experience into adulthood. Each repetition etched the practice deeper into the structure of daily life. As groups expanded across regions, these preserved foods developed unique forms. In coastal areas, dried fish became a staple, its salt content amplified by ocean spray and repeated rinsing. Inland groups fermented meat to withstand long winters, where sunlight was weak and drying unreliable. Over centuries, these early practices evolved into recognizable traditions: salted meats, cured fish, dried strips, and fermented pastes. Though refined in later civilizations, their origins traced back to the simple desperation of early humans facing unpredictable climates. The legacy extended beyond food itself. Preservation changed movement patterns. With dried portions packed in hides, groups traveled farther between camps, exploring new valleys and rivers without fear of immediate hunger. Fermented stores allowed them to survive early frosts, giving time to adapt before harsh seasons settled in fully. The ability to store food shaped migration routes, trade beginnings, and the earliest forms of settlement. In this way, preservation influenced not just survival, but the structure of human life. Even spiritual practices felt its influence. Some groups viewed dried meats as symbols of endurance kept aside for rituals or offered during communal events. Fermented foods, with their strong scents and transformative nature, were sometimes treated with caution or respect. These associations deepened as generations repeated the processes. Though their understanding was limited, they recognized that time itself changed food, and this transformation held meaning. But the legacy also carried burdens. Failed preservation led to illness, and misjudging fermentation sometimes resulted in hidden dangers. Groups learned through loss as much as through success. Over time, this balance between risk and reward shaped more careful handling of food. People became attuned to small signs, the feel of hardening flesh, the shift in color during drying, the distinct scent of properly fermented meat. These senses sharpened generation after generation, creating a quiet lineage of knowledge stored in the body rather than in language. Future societies would eventually develop salt-curing smoking chambers, clay jars, and fermentation techniques refined to near precision. But each advancement rested on the foundation laid by ancient trial and error. Long before villages or tools of metal, the fundamental truth had already formed. Food that lasted could extend life, shift the boundaries of travel, and reduce fear of the coming days. Preservation meant control within a world that offered none. This legacy endured because the principles never ceased to matter. Even as people settled, farmed, and built structures, drying racks returned each season. Fermentation pits reappeared in new forms: barrels, jars, and underground chambers. What began as a way to survive isolation or harsh winters transformed into culinary traditions treasured by later cultures. Fish sauces, cured meats, dried fruits, and preserved vegetables all traced their ancestry to those earliest choices made beside rivers, within caves, or near fires that burned through long nights. The long arc of these practices demonstrated a truth repeated across generations. Humans endured not by resisting nature, but by learning to work within its boundaries. Preservation became a form of negotiation, accepting decay as inevitable, but slowing it enough to carve out a stable moment between hunger and abundance. This legacy showed how survival often depended on carrying forward ideas that first emerged in struggle. In repeating these methods across generations, people shaped the earliest foundations of food keeping. Later, understanding deepened when they recognized how much of their existence depended on meals that endured long enough to reach the next day. Human survival has always depended on moments when food lasted longer than expected. Long before written memory, long before tools became precise, or shelters became permanent, small victories against decay shaped the future in ways the early groups could not have understood. Each crude method, whether drying in the sun, burying in warm ash, sheltering food in caves, or suspending strips from tree branches, represented an early step toward controlling the fragile boundary between life and spoilage. These actions were not guided by knowledge of bacteria or chemical change, but by observation born from hunger, illness, and the consequences of misjudgment. Across countless generations, each attempt deepened into instinct, and from instinct grew a lineage of practices that traveled far beyond their original purpose. In every environment, decay waited. Warm climates encouraged rapid softening. Cold climates hid signs of spoilage until it was too late. Rivers washed food away. Predators followed scent trails, and insects multiplied without pause. Against these forces, early humans had nothing more than their hands, their attention, and their willingness to test the landscape for clues. Preservation in its earliest form was not a craft. It was an ongoing negotiation with conditions that constantly shifted. When a method worked even briefly, it carried meaning. When it failed, the memory of loss shaped the next attempt. Over time, these countless repetitions carved a subtle knowledge base onto the lives of those who relied on such fragile protections. As groups moved across valleys, mountains, coastlines, and plains, their preservation strategies adapted in quiet increments. Burying food in ash delayed insects long enough for travel. Hanging meat from branches reduced contact with ground dwellers. Wrapping pieces in hides slowed exposure to air. Using cold streams created a temporary refuge against the heat. None of these methods guaranteed success yet. Each one extended food long enough to bridge gaps between the uncertainty of harvest and the unpredictability of the next hunt. These narrow extensions of time, sometimes mere hours, sometimes days, were the difference between endurance and collapse. Such actions laid the groundwork for later techniques that would shape human societies. Curing, fermenting, salting, drying, storing in stone jars, and eventually developing controlled environments for preservation. Though future generations refined these skills into stable processes, the origins remained tied to those early attempts that emerged under pressure rather than invention. Every cured fish, every fermented broth, every dried strip carried a faint echo of those first experiments performed beside primitive fires or beneath cold cave ceilings. As humans organized into settlements, the early techniques expanded into cultural practices. Drying racks appeared seasonally, not only for survival but for preparation ahead of winter. Salt, when discovered and traded, amplified preservation power and allowed food to travel across long distances. Fermentation evolved into stable products that nourished communities through harsh seasons. Yet the principles remained unchanged: remove moisture, restrict air control temperature, and allow time to reshape what nature threatened to claim. Entire cuisines, rituals, and traditions can trace their ancestry to those early struggles where necessity forged methods without names. The legacy extended to more than food. The ability to store nutrition influenced population growth, migration trade networks, and the development of early economies. Wherever preservation became reliable, groups could remain in one area longer, build structures, plan, and create early forms of stability. Without preserved food, seasonal scarcity would have kept populations small and movement constant. With it, communities gained a little safety, and from that safety emerged social structures, shared labor, and early forms of cooperation. The smallest techniques, burying a cut of meat, suspending a fish in cold air, wrapping a portion in leaf, or hide-shaped decisions that echoed through centuries. Modern life rarely reflects on these origins. Refrigerators hum quietly in homes. Packaged food travels across continents. Preservation is achieved through machinery, chemistry, and controlled environments that early humans could never have imagined. Yet beneath this convenience lies the same ancient truth: life persists only when food resists decay long enough to be consumed. The continuity remains unchanged, even if the methods have evolved beyond recognition. The distance between a modern freezer and a strip of meat drying above a prehistoric fire is wider in form than in purpose. Looking back, it is clear that every step of human progress depended on defeating the speed of rot. Without preserved food, migration would have faltered, agriculture would have developed much later, and trade routes would have remained small and fragile. Even storytelling, shared labor, and cultural identity grew in spaces where hunger was briefly held at bay. Preservation made those spaces possible, turning narrow moments of security into opportunities for reflection, planning, and connection. Human growth was not shaped by an abundance of food, but by an ability to keep scarce resources from spoiling too quickly. The story of early preservation is not a tale of triumph, but of persistence. No method was perfect, no attempt guaranteed, and no discovery emerged fully formed. Each generation carried fragments of knowledge, passing them silently through gesture and repetition rather than instruction. These fragments accumulated until the collective understanding became strong enough to influence entire ways of living. Humanity did not rise through strength alone, but through a steady accumulation of small resistances against forces that seemed impossible to control. The existence of modern societies rests quietly on those early resistances. The simple act of keeping food from rotting shaped the path that led to agriculture, settlement culture, and eventually civilization. It is easy to overlook how much depends on the ability to delay decay, but the truth remains clear. Survival depends not only on obtaining food, but on keeping it viable long enough to sustain life. Each crude method stood as a small milestone in the long path of human adaptation. In learning to slow the rot, people learned to shape time itself around their needs. History carried that understanding forward until it reached us long after the first hands buried the first piece of meat beneath warm ash. And now, as this final part draws to a close, may your thoughts settle gently. May the weight of these quiet histories soften into rest, and may the night take you toward calm and steady sleep. Good night.